Very warm welcome to our panelists and audience members today. I hope you and your loved ones are all safe and well. We are here today to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion at corporate India. And we couldn't have asked for a more esteemed and experienced panel with us this afternoon. I'm going to start with you, Anu. I've seen a lot of corporates in India where the focus on D&I, at least in my perspective, tends to be very unidimensional. And I'd love to hear from you on what you think diversity really means to you as an HR leader in this space. And what do you think, in your experience, are the emerging areas of focus, both globally and more relevantly from the domestic context, for diversity, equity, and inclusion in India?
Thanks so much, Aparna. Firstly, it's an absolute pleasure to be here with this panel. Everybody is just so accomplished. I hope I can do justice to the questions that you're going to ask me. I think, I'll take this from two standpoints. One is what it means to me personally is what I like to address first, and then quickly tie that in with how this happily comes together for from a Willis Towers Watson perspective. My perspective, the fact that we call it inclusion and diversity by itself is something quite important, because inclusion is that term, I feel, where irrespective of who you are beyond work, irrespective of what kind of an identity you have, what kind of an interest you have, your presence matters, your opinion matters. And to me personally, that part of inclusion, which is the quietest member of the team getting a chance to comment on something, are you as a leader making sure to include that person? Are there, of course, the topic that is quite prevalent is gender diversity. But apart from gender diversity, is there inclusion from different ages? Is a younger upcoming leader able to speak when there is somebody very senior, right? So to me, the inclusion part of inclusion and diversity is important, and it's something that will not happen naturally. You as a leader have to make that effort to create that environment where you're drawing in people from various streams, because you want their opinion. And to me, it's that part of diversity that is so important, because by including those different thoughts, you bring a certain extent of diversity of opinion. And without that diversity of opinion, I don't believe any opinion that's fostered by the team could actually be considered adequate. You need to be able to challenge each other, because you have different points of view, and you're bringing that because of different conditioning, different identities. It could be cultural, it could be gender, it could be sexual identity, any identity. It has to count. To me, that's the meaning. At Willis Towers Watson, diversity follows inclusion very similarly, and that really helped to sort of fashion my thoughts as well. The fact that it was inclusion first and then diversity was something that I was able to really relate to, and is something that is typified in our organization top down. It starts from the CEO, who sets the tone, which I think again is very, very important. So at Willis Towers Watson, we have 5 networks. They range from gender to LGBT plus to workability, and a couple more that I'll probably touch upon through the course of this conversation. But that's in short where I come from as an individual. Every opinion needs to matter, and it needs to have a place. And in order to do that, you need to have, different kinds of people in the organization and the team.
Thank you, Anu. And I think I personally am a big believer in the fact that our approach to D&I has to be multidimensional. And we cannot ignore the impact of intersectionality. I mean, when you look at a trans person, but a trans person from a minority religious community will have it worse off than, so you have to keep looking at the compounding effect of a lot of these factors, and not just the key, pivots of D&I that I see in the Indian market today. I'll come to you, Jaishankar. Now you work with one of the leading MNCs of the world, and I personally have done a lot of work with Bharti to know the broad perspective that they bring in. My personal grouse with a lot of companies that I see in India today is that there is a lack of strategy when it comes to D&I. So we have a business plan for finance. We have, an operations plan for how the business is going to run. But D&I somehow is the stepchild. Nobody wants to come forward and have a robust strategy or a map for how the organization has to grow. So in your view, Jaishankar, what are the key pillars of a robust DE&I strategy that our audience can hear from you today and really perhaps go back and imbibe that in their own day-to-day work at the corporates they represent with us?
Thanks for bringing that up, Aparna. And once again, like Anu said, a big thanks to the ET team for inviting me to be part of this August panel. Really privileged to be speaking along with many of them. Regrettably so, Aparna, every single word that you said is actually true. Most organizations do not have a strong business case for D&I as a pillar of strategy. Most of them who do actually are part of a larger global organization and are, in a way, I would say, urged to have one at the local level because the global headquarters runs a particular strategy or an approach across locations. You will rarely, if any, see a pure, homebred Indian company, Indian organization, approaching D&I as a conscious strategic choice. I think the Godrej Group is a lighthouse in that sense, where they very consciously, have called out and set out on this journey. Most others are actually playing catch up, and what you see in the last 1 month is actually just a manifestation of this. Almost everybody is talking on LinkedIn about how they are doing things for their employees, vaccinations, support for diseased employees, so on and so forth. It's almost like a catch-up game. There's a competition. D&I in many ways is turning out to be like that. Very few organizations actually have given thought of why is diversity important to them. And again, most stop at the first milestone of diversity as an agenda, which is just to make sure that there's a certain percentage of women in your workforce. I have personally struggled in the organizations that I work with to start with even basic diversity of thought. And especially in the sector that I work in, which is life insurance, I've realized that there's a huge preference or even an affinity to engaging with people that we have worked with in the past as leaders move organizations. Now, here is my question. If I'm not even ready to work with the new set of team members that I get in my new organization, how can I even go out and talk about being a diversity friendly, being an inclusion focused organization? I think what you really need to start with is start developing tolerance at the very least, and appreciation at the second level of diverse thoughts, diverse personalities at the workplace. There is a cliche which goes about diversity and inclusion that states that diversity is being invited to the party and inclusion is actually being called for a dance on the dance floor. Most people are just ticking off numbers. They're ticking off check boxes that, yes, I have so many women on my workforce. I have a certain set of things for differently able people. But at the end of the day, these kind of stand out. And in a way, then they become more exclusion than inclusion, because a larger part of your organization is actually pointing fingers that why is somebody getting preferential treatment and what have we done lesser. So I think the point that you said, the question that you directed to me, I've actually not come to answer that because I don't have an answer on, what would be those pillars around which we build diversity and inclusion? Because I think the first step itself is where a lot of us are way behind in the line, which is accepting the fact that this is a way of life and not necessarily building a goal or a target on, what should be the diversity numbers, what kind of diversity should we have. It's as good as you have a differently able child born in your family. You're not going to have a strategy around how to deal with that individual, right? You accept that person as a part of your life and you just go on. The problem is when you set out to have a diversity strategy, when you create days or weeks around, how to drive diversity, then we are creating a bigger problem than we are trying to solve.
Can I jump in and answer this question a
Yes,
bit?
please.
While it's not a strategy, Jay, and you're right, I agree completely with what all you said. But, the way we look at it within Tata Group is, a little bit more holistically. So it can't just be one-pronged strategy. It has to appeal to different levels, and it has to cater to different audiences at any given point of time. In the group, we also believe that the onus is on us to look at diversity beyond the Tata employees. We should impact the societies, the communities we live in. And unless we do that, it is not going to be meaningful at all. Because at the end of the day, the employee who's walking into your door is also a microcosm of the society. And if you're not addressing this issue at a societal level, you're just trying to create a bubble, which is never going to be enough. So with that, we look at 4 different ways in which we can achieve this. One is by looking at leaders in action. We call it leadership in action. So it's not just people who are committed, people who are willing to sponsor, people who really believe in this and who want to drive it from the top, and who are also role modeling the fact that they are open to diverse thoughts, diverse perspectives, and diversity in true sense and form, right? So that is what we call as leadership in action. The second bit which we say is nurturing ecosystem, which means that on the whole, the organization should provide me enough to nurture myself, however I am, right? So when you talk about inclusion, bringing the best out of me by ensuring that I'm getting the nurturing input. So there are various initiatives that we have in each of these buckets, which address some of these challenges. The third one, which we call is communicate to engage. Unless you go to the lowest level of organization and make them understand what you mean by inclusion, what you mean by diversity, you will never be done. So, how do I hook each and every individual to one cause or the other of diversity and inclusion is something that we are really striving to get to. And of course, last but not least is how does data power our progress? So we measure this not as a metric, but as a, it's still a lag measure. There is no lead measure to this, which we look to see that, where else do we need to work on so that we ensure that we continue to move forward in our journey. So that's really, Aparna, it's not a strategy, it's a working model which evolves every day. There can't be a strategy which is foolproof and complete, otherwise we won't be having this discussion at all.
Thank you both, Jaishankar and Leena, and I agree with both of you in parts. The reason I asked about strategy is because I think any kind of ad hocism or a reactive approach to D&I cannot be fruitful. And the reason, as advisors in the D&I space, we talk about strategy is exactly, I think, Leena, what you were saying, is we need to understand, is there allocation of resource? Is our D&I initiative trickling down to every corner of the organization? Are all people included in the organization's journey on what it wants to do? Not so much on the tokenism or, on the rainbow colored logos or the targets so much, but really to ensure that all your policies, and I come from both the corporate law and D&I space, by strategy is to make sure that, what we are doing, it really is enforceable and implementable in the organization in the long run. And that even if one person sitting somewhere feels that they have been missed out, there has to be a strategy or a process or a system by which they can get whatever they require in the organization. But I'll come to you now, Ravi. Clearly, I think when we talk about strategy, and to my mind, I think those baskets are very clear, whether they are your policies, whether it's allocation of resource, or as Leena said, also the culture of the organization. And on culture, I just want you to go beyond that and tell me that, how have you at Bajaj Auto integrated D&I into the entire life cycle? Because it's not just about the focus areas of D&I that Anu talked about to start with, whether it's gender, it's LGBT, it's age, but how do you ensure that it's holistically implemented through the employee life cycle? If you could share your thoughts with us.
Thanks. Couple of things. One, diversity, in my opinion, is actually a journey, right? There is actually no end goals to it. When I grew up, what was considered to be cutting edge diversity practice is very different than what it is today, and rightly so. And I'm pretty sure 10 years from now, if you were to reflect, the things that we call today as the organizations who are in the cutting edge of the diversity world would no longer be that, because it is a journey, it's an evolution. And it is not only for an organization. Actually, if we were to all self-reflect on ourselves, right? Um, when I were to, if anybody were to ask me, I would consider myself to be a person who is accepting of diversity, who doesn't have biases, etc., conscious biases, right? But then if I truly reflect and then look at myself, my own personal journey, I would realize that I've come a long way from what I was during my college, what kind of tolerance levels I had for people who are different than me. And it's not just about gender. It is not just about sexual orientation. It's about north-south divide, right? It's about people with quote unquote brains and people who had brawn. It is about people who valued money versus people who valued education, multiple things. It doesn't matter. Each one of us are born inherently the way we grew up. There is just so much biases that have been brought into us. And unless we actually actively reflect upon ourselves and work on those biases, that journey is stifled. Then what happens is the journey becomes tokenism. Because yeah, they are doing, so I have to do it. But the true difference happens in actually on self-reflection. And that is true for me as an individual, that is true for an organization, that is true for Bajaj as a corporation, right? So I still remember a conversation that I was having with our managing director, Rajiv Bajaj, and I was asking him about this topic, and he said, he was actually quoting Ramana Maharishi, right? He was saying, Ravi, there are no others. It is us, and it is all of us are the same. There are no others. That to me is the essence of diversity. There are no others. Everybody is us and we are everybody, right? If that objective can be furthered, and it's not something just like nirvana, one cannot really achieve it. At least most of us cannot achieve it. But that reflection, that really putting the mirror on our own face, putting the mirror on the organization, I think will help us in the journey. And to me, that is HR's job, right? So I have to first reflect on myself, my own biases, and I have to improve. And then I have to be willing to put that mirror on the organization. Most people would not like mirror to be put on their faces, right? So because that is difficult to accept, easy to do actions, very difficult to accept philosophical changes. So for me, diversity is about a philosophical journey. And that is what we truly believe in Bajaj as an organization. Once you look at it from that perspective, then the life cycle becomes easier, because fundamentally it is not what you do differently. It is how you do it, right? You're not going to go hire differently. You're not going to go and say that I am only going to hire women. No, it is about what is the process that you are doing today. How can you do that process a little differently so that you can usher in that change that we are trying to bring about? And that change has to be brought in to truly reflecting what are the inherent biases in my selection today. What are the inherent biases that we have in our sourcing? What are the inherent biases that we have in our selection? What are the inherent biases that we have in our promotions? What are the inherent biases we have in our compensation? Then how do I accept that these biases are there? And then what do I do to break those? It is a journey. We are nowhere close to being where we want to be. We don't really worry about matrices because it's a short-term measure to see whether we are improving or not. So that extent metrics help. But the reality is these biases will exist, will continue to exist. We'll have to work one after the other. So this is my answer for however convoluted it might be.
Thank you. And what I have personally seen a lot in what helps in the employee life cycle is to really take it to the micro granular extent of, from the onboarding form to the questions you're asking, in the participants when they come for the interview. And I would love for our panelists in the forthcoming questions to try and get into a little bit more of detail, because for the audience that we are talking to today, they would love to learn from you how have you done it, and not just the why you're doing it at the organization. Leena, I'll come to you, and you represent one of the largest conglomerates in India, and the group really shines forth with the extent of work they have done for real integration of society and people we live with and work with. One specific question I wanted to hear from you, and I'm just joining the dots with what you were saying, that at the Tata Group, DE&I goes beyond the HR aspects of DE&I. It actually looks at integrating societies around them. So can you share some examples of what has the group done to really integrate historically marginalized communities within the employment cycle or otherwise? And especially, We see a lot of corporate India talking about race, but we don't talk about caste. And I do know that, the Tata Group has done a lot through its affirmative action policies. I'd love to hear from you.
You said the word, Aparna. We have been very keenly looking at affirmative actions, especially in areas where we have marginalized population, by making them self-sustained and providing them means to kind of earn their living, using their talent that they bring to the table. And one of those very strong brands that are known across is the Okai Group, which is something that Tata Chemicals had kind of initiated a few years back, and then it's now a big brand, and it's done by women across the area of Mithapur, where our Tata Chemicals plant is. It's a self-sustaining brand now. So we have several examples like that on affirmative actions. If I have to look historically as well, Aparna, when Jamshedpur was being set as a city, in those times, and this is way long back when inclusion and diversity was not even a topic. That's where you found that our founders spoke about having, all religions represented in how we built the city for the first steel plant, which is which was coming up. So I think those are some specific examples I can give. I'm not the right person to talk about affirmative action, but I can tell you that through various initiatives that we have, across the organization and also led by the CSR teams, we do look out for people who are perhaps needing that affirmation by providing them right opportunities and creating those right opportunities for them.
Thank you. And I think, I've been following a lot of the work that your group does. And I think the focus I want the audience to keep today is that with employment, we also have to look at employability. And with a lot of historically marginalized communities, which have been put years behind just because of lack of access to education or, financial inclusion, focus in D&I strategy on employability, like the Tata Group has done, and Leena gave us some examples, really goes a long way. Because, when I asked about, employee life cycle, I see a lot of organizations hiring persons with disabilities, but the person is hired, but they never grow in the system. And it is really demotivating for somebody to sit on the same job for the next 30 years. So I think, to me as a consultant, when I talk about D&I strategy, it's to think about every person as a full being and as a full citizen at work. And how do we make sure that every benefit, every process, every kind of career path really is available to every person in equitable ways, irrespective of where they come from. And I would love to hear from, HR leaders like you, and how have you really taken that from an abstract conversation to reality? I'll come to you now, Anu. These are difficult times, and they're also difficult times for a lot of corporations, with the business impact of the ongoing pandemic. And my personal focus on D&I is that to have a robust strategy, to have a robust roadmap in front of us in terms of what the organization wants to achieve, how are they going to dedicate time and resource. I want you to tell us that, how does our audience today, which is a vast range of, HR folks attending, how do they go back to their management and negotiate allocation of time and financial resource to D&I measures? Because we can talk about D&I, we can glorify it for what we can, but unless we put clear, initiatives backed with time and money resource, not much is going to change. So what are your tips to our audience today? How do they influence their management to take this as an important imperative?
It is important for the organization to realize where they stand as well. There are different maturity curves, and for some, it may not be about the numbers, it may be about actually tackling inherent biases. For some, it may actually well be about an increase in a number. So you've got to first look at where your starting point is. From Willis Towers Watson perspective, our focus for a few years now had been gender diversity. And we actually were able to accomplish a 1:1 ratio. Okay, sounds great, fabulous. Okay. Then struck COVID. And in the COVID scenario, this entire advantage that we had of 1:1 really came to light. And it was a conversation that actually had to be had with business to say that if we are not able to offer flexibility, for example, the fact is these women may drop out of the workforce. This is real. It is going to impact you. When your staffing level dips by, say, 20%, we cannot wake up to it then. So we need to work with you to ensure that there is flexibility, there is the ability to, actually completely switch off for 3 to 4 hours to handle multiple priorities. And then, very importantly, there's got to be recognition of the fact that chores are still not shared. Okay, and we need to be able to make an example of this. So you as a business leader first might have to do that little bit of a check that Ravi and Jay said, right? Have we checked within ourselves, to see if we are actually leading the way? You've got to speak about this in your teams, and you've got to actually do something to help the fact that it's an idealistic stage where chores are actually shared. At this point in time, the women actually are spending about 30% more time, 30 to 40%, proven statistics globally, not only in India. They spend more time balancing between work and home. So they are actually working harder. So what can we do in order to flex it for them so that your absenteeism doesn't go up, your staffing is actually still optimal, and thereby, productivity and delivery goals are also being met. Equally, there are conversations where you have to evidence, the fact that, look, we brought in these people from a program called Careers 2.0. There are always first movers where, you have a few people who are willing to sort of step up and take the bait and actually participate in it. And then they are the first followers. And then they are the rest, right? So from the standpoint of evidencing that, look, we went into this program, and one of the things we did is we said we will not ask why you took a break, of people who want to return to the career force. We will not ask how long the break was. We will look at the capabilities, we'll look at the competency. It will be right person for the right role. We will not ask these questions. The first year, we had to make an example of these people. We had to bring them in, we had to measure performance, and then we had to go back to business and say, look, this is how these people have performed, fair and square. Are you now going to buy into this program? So I think the negotiation has to be backed with some first movers, some first followers, some data on the successes that you have, equally data on what could happen if you miss a beat here. So it has to be a combination of aspiration, but it also needs to have data backed conversations. That's been my experience.
No, thank you. And I agree with you. The more you can, at some level, though it may be intangible, but put in some matrix like Leena talked about, data, it really helps move the needle in some way. And in some ways, I think it brings in what Ravi was saying, that you can hold a mirror to the organization and really see what are you doing. And otherwise, it all remains a black hole. Nobody knows what's not happening and nobody wants to talk about it. And how do you really proactively move the organization forward on inclusion? Leena, I'll come to you now. I think personally to me, I think any kind of D&I policy or D&I initiatives without having a redressal mechanism is not complete. And I would love to hear from you about how have you institutionalized your anti-discrimination or grievance redressal mechanisms, and how have you used them to supplement your inclusion strategy, so that anything that happens at any corner of the organization, there can be some kind of measure to address it and to make sure it's probably not repeated if it were to happen.
See, there are various ways in which you address it, and the most preferred way for us is to have a proactive channel of communication, which is ongoing, which is not there only for if an event occurs. You try and understand the situation on the ground. A lot of our companies have already incorporated this ongoing channel of communication with their employees, where they are free to reach out to senior leaders, HR organization, as and when there is a situation emerging. Having said that, you do have situations where things get out of hand, and that's when you have a formal way of creating a redressal. We have what we call as Tata Code of Conduct, and through that, people can reach out to ethics or ombudsperson in an organization. Around sexual harassment per se, Aparna, you're well aware because you helped us in creating a renewed policy a couple of years back. We do have the formal mechanism which people reach out to. But what I've seen often work is if the culture is conducive, if people are accessible, which is how we would like our leaders to be. People, even before they use a formal channel, always come forward and bring that issue out. And there is no better way than that to address a situation. There are other opportunities that we leverage through, proactively having, discussions with people around challenges that they see, which are emerging in the organization through focus group discussions, etc. Making sure that the voice of people is heard at all points of time. So, there is not one approach, Aparna. You have to have multi-pronged approach so that you address, different challenges that are coming through. Having said that, we do have a formal mechanism, as I mentioned to you already, which works very well for us.
Thank you, Leena. And I think it's very essential to understand that, code of conducts and this is not about POSH, but, more about the generic code of conducts and disciplinary procedures that companies ought to have. And just to bring that connectivity between every employee to what they face in the organization through ombudsman processes, or really employee reach out programs that Leena talked about, which can really ensure that, it's not just the code of conduct, but in action, there is nothing happening on the floor of the organization which can be discriminatory or can make somebody feel left out from what is being done at the organization. So thanks for that, Leena. Jay, I'll come back to you now. It's June, and I can see every organization in India have a pride colored logo. And ironically, I know at least 90% of them who I have interacted with have done nothing internally but for changing the color of their logo. They have not done DE&I sessions. They have not looked at LGBT inclusion, holistically. They don't have a single policy, and perhaps they don't even have members of the community employed at the organization. So Jay, how, and when you look at the 2000 plus audience that is with us today, how do you really inspire HR leaders to step up? How do you make them do what Anu and Ravi have talked about, to take painful steps one by one, to create strategy and to create implementation, and not just go for the low-hanging fruit, which is a low, pride-colored logo? So really, how do we bring in substance over form and real change over, quick gimmicks like making your logo pride-colored?
So Aparna, I'll actually pick up one thought which Ravi said and which kind of stayed on very deeply in my mind. The day you let go of a concept of others is when you kind of solve the problem. And I'll also draw an analogy from what happened in COVID, phase 1 and wave 2. Phase 1 was happening out there somewhere, until it hit us home, until we knew somebody who was admitted to a hospital or who lost a life, or in many cases very close to us in our own families. It was always something that would happen that we all knew was happening across the world, but we didn't really worry about it. I think in many ways, the matter of inclusion and diversity is very much like that. The point that you said about how Pride Month is just a change of colors in the logo is actually, very relevant in our context. Until we have someone of an alternate sexual orientation working with us as part of our lives and families, for us, it will always be something that's out there. Dusre log kar rahe hain, it's a good thing to do. Let's go change our colors on LinkedIn, and we will be shown as having allegiance or affinity to this whole agenda. I think what is most important is create that environment, and there are many ways of doing it, of first and foremost allowing somebody to be comfortable about his or her choices, and one of them being sexual orientation. I think what is very difficult for a lot of people is the fear of ridicule. It doesn't matter what background they come from, doesn't matter what pedigree they have, how well performing they are. At the end of the day, if this one piece of information comes out, there is a great fear that I will be isolated, I will be ridiculed, I will be outcast. And then all of what I have created and worked over my entire lifetime suddenly comes to naught. And hence, I think what is most important is also the part which Leena said, that it shouldn't matter what is my caste, my religion. And I would say pride as a concept is also falling in the same, kind of bucket. While globally, I think the concept of pride came about because of the need for affirmative action. But the moment you say that there is this 1 month where I'll go out and celebrate diversity, itself then kind of creates this environment of exclusion. This is something that we should engage in, talk about, celebrate on a regular basis. And I mean, even if I take the comparison with Women's Day, as much as I know women who would like to have a Women's Day to celebrate and recognize, the fact of their independence, I know as many women who actually look down upon this because they don't want to be singled out. They say, why do we need a day to celebrate us? We are celebrating ourselves every day. And I think that's also the case when it comes to, the LGBTQ workforce in many ways, because let's face it, many of us in our workforce, in our offices are still not mature to have a conversation with somebody who we suddenly realize comes from a different orientation. Suddenly the discussion becomes very uncomfortable. There are a lot of awkward silences. And hence, I think what all of us need to do at our workplace is to make sure that anybody of any alternative choice, and maybe not even a choice, things like religion, caste are actually thrust upon us. We don't get to choose many of it. There should not be a reason or a situation where a person is standing out because the majority is of a different choice or kind of orientation or nature. And that, I think, is what we will need to do even when it comes to pride and the LGBTQ community.
Thanks for that, Jayesh. And I actually think that, when we're looking at the employment cycles in India today, I think a lot of youngsters, even before they join the organization, they want to know what the organization is doing. So sometimes I think, low-hanging fruits or just optical gimmicks will not help organizations. Truly, if they have to attract the right talent force, they have to create sustainable long-term initiatives internally, which create inclusion, like all of you have talked about. I'll come to you, Ravi, and you talked about the philosophy of introspection and how you can really begin to correct and bring in reform if you start looking at yourself as well. I want you to go a little bit into detail, and because a lot of what you talked about in terms of introspection comes from awareness. And if people are not self-aware, we cannot leave the baton of inclusion to them because it becomes a vicious cycle. I don't know what I'm doing wrong. And even if I introspect, I'm not going to change it. So Ravi, how do we change that? How do we encourage more introspection? How do we encourage allies really to step up across the corporate ladder to support different aspects of DE&I? It could be persons with disability, it could be LGBT, it could be women. But really, how do we make sure that DE&I is not just for people in the organization, but every member of the workforce becomes a DE&I champion in some?
Yeah, this is actually a very interesting question, Aparna. And in reality, I don't have the answer. I can only share my personal journey, which is always what I always fall back on. When I was going through this in my previous organization, not at Bajaj, but before that, I was working for a company called Texas Instruments, and I was in Dallas, right? And I obviously considered myself to be a very open person who was very welcoming of different thoughts, considered myself to be a liberal person too, and all of that. But then an incident happened at work where I had to help a person who was changing the gender, get assimilated into the organization. And for me, yeah, so what's a big deal, right? Yeah, sure. We are very open, but then the nitty-gritties on how they will come out, how to help them, as simple a thing as which, toilet would they use? Till one day they are using in a toilet, and then they go get their surgery done, come back, what would their acceptance be in using the other gender's toilet, and how do you actually come out with it? How do you help that person get embraced in the organization? And suddenly I realized that I was completely ill-equipped to handle that level of, and over here, you actually think that you're a very open individual, you have all the answers, and then you go into a situation and then you realize that, oh my God, and if I have no idea, how am I going to shepherd this organization into it, right? And then I went and spoke with my leader at that point in time, and then she gave me a great idea. She said, Ravi, go to a conference, right? Go to a diversity con, go to an LGBT conference. And I said, but I'm not of that orientation. She says, no, that's not about it. You have to go, you have to be there, you have to see, you have to hear. And honestly, I spent some time in a couple of conferences, and it just completely opened my eyes. Not in terms of ideas, not in terms of my own self, just in terms of the difficulties that people are going through, right? We just assume that we know. In reality, we don't. What my wife goes through, I can be right next to her and watching her, but still I would not realize the difficulties that she has gone through in her career. And it's very, very difficult just to observe unless you really get into it, right? From outside in perspective, just doesn't work. So my exhortation to all the leaders is actually, the only way to do this is actually go and talk to people, go and listen, right? Understand the difficulties. Don't just jump into solutioning. Don't just go and say, I'm going to transfer, I'm going to change, right? I saw a couple of times when people are given leaves in the recent past in LinkedIn, you would have seen, right? We have given leaves for certain, like period issues for women. Now, should we do it? So I went and spoke to a lot of women. They said, no, we want help, but don't call it that, right? And then I'm saying, okay, so why don't we call it an exigency leave? So we put across an exigency leave, which anybody can take for whatever exigencies. Nobody needs to give us any reason for. The point is, unless we go and speak openly to women saying, is this the right solution? Is that what you're looking for? Would this actually help you? Instead of just sitting and architecting in a conference room, just go talk to people. I think similar to that when it comes to LGBT community or anybody else, unless we actually go speak, will we ever get some perspective? Even that truly will not be deep enough, but I think that's much better than architecting, sitting in a conference room or reading periodicals. So for me, I don't have the answer. The only thing I follow is to reach out, to listen, to learn, to try to understand, to get the perspective, and then see what I can do with it in my organization.
I'm surprised, Ravi, you say that you didn't have the answer. I think you've given us the best answer. I think as allies, we have to be there. We have to approach people with an open mind, and we have to be willing to learn from them. And as an HR leader and a senior leader, if you're open enough to say that, I think that's the best learning for our audience today. That we have to be open to learning, understanding, not assuming what somebody is going through or not going through, and really leveraging, employee resource groups, community discussions, to really reach out and understand. And I think that really is the high note I would like to wrap up this conversation on. Because if each one of us can listen and absorb, I think we will become DE&I champions by, just becoming more empathetic about the people we live with. So, I would have loved to take this conversation forward and delve into more detail into aspects like bias and awareness. But I have to wrap up now. We've clocked our time. Thank you very much to each of the panelists for making yourselves available in the middle of, I'm sure, a lot of work that you're in the midst of. And thank you to our audience for listening in. I think the panelists and I will be available for Q&A, and you can type your questions into the chat box. We'd be happy to answer them. And you can feel free to reach out to us through LinkedIn should you have any follow-up questions or any guidance that you need from the leaders that we have this afternoon. Thank you. Stay safe, and very nice connecting with all of you.